So I ask you to look at the following question. Why are some people more at risk to hazards than others? And what I've done is I've taken the conceptual and contextual framework model, placed it in the center of this picture, and then I've added the overlay here at the top to show you the concepts that we're thinking about. When we take a look at this model and we think, well, what is the content which we could be looking at? You'll be familiar at this stage with hazards, and you've probably followed a course which has introduced you to a variety of hazards. This question was predominantly to do with Haiti. So we could be talking about volcanoes or landslides, mass movements. We'll stick with earthquakes. So if we think about our knowledge of content here on earthquakes, well, what do we think about? Well, causes of them might be important. We might be thinking about processes there that lead to earthquakes occurring. We're certainly thinking about the scale of earthquakes, what makes the magnitude of an earthquake, what makes that vary from one place to another. We might be thinking about different places. We might be thinking about the level of development within a country and how that affects earthquakes. And certainly we would be thinking about, well, the responses to earthquakes and how they might vary from one place to another. The context for this earthquake is the kind of evidence that we're going to draw on. So we're going to talk about Haiti, and then maybe we'll talk about Port-au-Prince as the capital city, which was infected there, in the big way. But the question doesn't talk about Haiti. So we can draw on evidence here as we choose. So for example, you might want to contrast places. You might want to look at a developed country, perhaps New Zealand. Or you might want to look at an emerging economy and maybe start to explore how some of those content ideas affect different places in different contexts. Is there a timescale context to this? Have some places learnt lessons from previous earthquakes and maybe had the advantage there of dealing with that? So we've got content and context coming together. We're going to try to illustrate some of these ideas in these places. And then when we start to think about kind of how the concepts come in, well, you might be thinking, well, actually, we're already thinking about that, aren't we? We've got place examples, which we're going to draw on in our context. We're talking about large-scale processes that cause earthquakes. Then we might start to be thinking about environmental and human processes that localize these impacts and localize these processes and create spatial variation. So when we think about spatial variation, why is it that maybe some parts of a city get decimated and other areas actually escape with very little damage? What is it to do with the environmental conditions or indeed human processes on the ground which might influence that? And then when we start to explore that, we might be thinking about power relations. We might even be considering wealth as a factor. And the classic idea here is to contrast maybe the impacts of an earthquake on a developed country versus a less developed country. What about wealth differences within the same city? Are some people more vulnerable than others? And why is that the case? Does power come into that? Does governance come into that? So in doing this, we're really starting to explore some of those human processes which might have an impact on variations. And what we see here is we're talking about the scale of the actual events, scale, the magnitude, as well as the spatial variation. So these organizing concepts of scale start to really interplay with some of these 4P concepts. We haven't mentioned possibility here, have we? Obviously, what this term kind of refers to is this idea of uncertainty. What are possible futures? What are possible responses? What are possible impacts? And these things are determined by those place factors and those environmental and human factors, and maybe above all, the scale of an earthquake.